For Brother Josh's lesson comes from the book of Romans. If you'd like to follow along, chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Romans 4, 1 through 3. What then shall we say that Abraham our father has found according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness.
Good morning. Steve wasn't kidding. I hope y'all are awake, because I am, and I hope that y'all are too. But either way, it is good to see everyone here this morning. Thank y'all so much for being here. Got a lot of new faces in the crowd, a lot of visitors. So I just want to say thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. And for everybody else, thank you for being here as well. I truly believe that every time that we meet together on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday night, this is where we grow closer to each other. As well as to God. And it's vital for us to be together. In Acts chapter 4, all of the Christians in Jerusalem shared everything. They had all things in common, and they were together always. And that is, just one of the many reasons why Jesus created the church, to be a community. But this morning, we're going to be talking about something that is very misunderstood. And, in secular society, and in their secular definition of what it is, and in our theme for this year, inspired from the inspired book of Romans, I hope today we can get inspired to be faithful. Because the word faith, in and of itself, and I usually don't do this, but I thought it was interesting, important, and necessary for our study today. But the word faith in the original Greek is pistis. Pistis. Y'all know me. I've told you this before. I went to Freed. I was in a Greek class for about half of a year, and then I dropped out because I was failing, and that's all the Greek I ever had. But there is something called the Strong's Concordance. And in Strong's Concordance, there is a corresponding number to every single word in there. And that number, you can take it and plug it into Strong's Interlinear. And it will give you the definition and the original Greek word for whatever word you're looking at. And so that's just a little bit of a, that's interesting, and that's really nice when you're studying really deeply in the Bible. But the Greek word is pistis. I hope that I'm pronouncing it right. Because in the original Greek, when they referred to faith, they did not take it as what so many take it as today. Faith to them was not blind. Faith to them was not something that we just hope happens, and that we hope something is going to happen, and we don't really have any evidence. No, their word, pistis, was a guarantee or evidence in whatever they were looking at. The Greek root word of the word pistis is pitho, maybe? I'm saying it confidently. Pitho. If you say it confidently, you're right, because we have no idea. We probably do have an idea, I just don't. But pitho, the root word of pistis, was to persuade or to be persuaded. And so, the literal definition of faith in the original language is divinely persuaded based upon the guarantee or evidence from the Holy Scriptures. When we're talking about the Bible, that is what faith is. Hebrews 11, chapter 1, also, the Bible gives its own definition of faith. A very interesting passage to look at, and one that I'm sure we all have heard and read so many times in our lives. But Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." So yes, we don't see God. We see him working. We see him through his creation. We see him through his people. But we cannot physically go to heaven and physically shake God's hand. We can't do it. We can't see him. We can't feel him. We can't physically be there with him. However, this passage in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 says, the assurance of things hoped for. This is not something that the early Christians threw around recklessly. Faith to them was knowledge. Faith to them was based upon evidence. They were sure that what they were believing was the truth. This morning, good people, we're going to be talking about faith. And faith to a Christian is what saves us on our end. The mercy and the grace and the love of God is what truly saves us. But faith is what saves us on our end. And from everything that we've been reading in Romans so far, we've gone from chapter 1 all the way now to chapter 4. In everything we've been reading in chapters 2 through 3, Paul has been getting the church at Rome ready to talk about faith. Because really and truly, this was something that was new to these Christians. Most of them had either come from a Jewish background or a Gentile background. And throughout the entire, Old Testament, God talked to them. God spoke to Adam and Eve in the garden. God spoke to all of the prophets. And so this faith thing, not being able to see him, not being able to have divine revelation after Revelation was written, this was going to be sort of new for them. And yet the evidence that was given in the Holy Scriptures for so many throughout the century, so many throughout these 2,000 years, even with all the advances, even with everything that has gone on, it has been more than enough to show people that yes, the God of the Bible that we serve is real, He is active, and He is working in all of our lives. And so it's this morning we have two questions that we're going to ponder. I like the word ponder. The first one is, are you divinely persuaded based upon the evidence from the Holy Scriptures? And so that's the first one. Do you have faith is basically, what that question boils down to. And the second question is, are you living in accordance to that faith? James chapter 1 and 2 tells us that faith is good, and faith is essential, and faith is necessary. But if faith is not backed up by our works, it's useless. And so first of all, do we have faith? And second of all, are we living by that faith? And to do that, we're going to look at two passages. One of them, the one that Sean read for us this morning, in Romans chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. And so if y'all will, go ahead and turn over there for me real quick, and we'll read that once again. But we're also going to go to another one in Genesis chapter 22. Romans chapter 4, verses 1 through 3 talks about Abraham. It talks about his faith. It talks about him believing in God because it was credited to him for righteousness. Romans 4 says, "What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, has found? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God." And so Abraham was this great guy. He was, the father of the Jewish people. And yet, the Bible says that even though he was great, he could not boast about his works. Are we living by our faith? It's got to be a question that each of us ask ourselves. And if the question is no, then something in our lives needs to change. Because this is not a game. We do not come to worship on Sunday morning. We don't come to Bible class on Sunday morning or worship on Sunday evening or Wednesday night Bible class. We don't come to them because we're playing at being a church. We don't come to them because we're playing to love Jesus. We don't come to them. This is life and this is death. Eternal life and death. And it is so important that we take this seriously, that we take this faith thing that the Scriptures talk about all throughout. We take these work things that James talks about and we apply them to our lives. Because too often we pretend like it doesn't matter what we do. Because God can't physically, He's not here. You know? God physically, we can't see Him. We can't feel Him. We can't interact with Him physically. And yet, God is here. God can interact with us. He does interact with us. He does answer us when we talk to Him. Having faith and acting upon it is the difference between living forever in perfection or living forever in torment. And today we're going to look at a great example of faith. Because Abraham, the father of the Jews, certainly was not perfect. You know, he was a liar. He was a doubter. He was a fornicator. Abraham was a lot of things. And he was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But what set Abraham apart was that he trusted God with all his heart. Today I want to see what we can learn from him in Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 18. It's a pretty long passage, and so if y'all will, go ahead and turn over there. We're just going to pick this passage apart in our time together this morning, and then we'll have some things to say after it. But in Genesis chapter 22, starting in verses 1 through 2, here's what Moses writes about Abraham. Okay, we know that Moses is the one who wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, but he was doing it divinely inspired, and so God has put everything into his mind to write. And so in Genesis chapter 22, starting in verse 1, we read, "Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to Abraham, 'Abraham,' and he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you.'" Genesis chapter 22 and verse 2, God tells Abraham to do the unimaginable. No, I can't even begin to imagine what Abraham must have been feeling. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But God asked Abraham to do the impossible, to give up Isaac, a son that he loved, to give up Isaac, the son that he had been waiting 100 years for, to give up Isaac, the son of promise, the miracle child that God had promised to Abraham and Sarah. God came to Abraham and told him to sacrifice his only son on an altar in the land of Moriah. I cannot even begin to imagine how that must have been for Abraham. Because without Isaac, this promised miracle child, God's promise would never be able to come to pass. Without Isaac, there would be no Jacob. Without Isaac, there would be no David. Without Isaac, there would be no Jesus. And without Jesus, there would be no salvation. Isaac's death would not only affect Abraham and Sarah, it would affect millions of people. And it would affect each and every single one of us. I cannot even begin to imagine what must have been going on in Abraham's mind. And yet, we keep on reading in chapter 22, verses 3 through 4, and we read, "So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. And on the 3rd day Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance." I cannot imagine what Abraham must have been feeling, but instead of questioning God, instead of asking why, instead of complaining or doubting or anything else that we might imagine, Abraham heads to the place that God would tell him. He gets up early the next morning, saddles up his donkey, takes 2 of his guys with him, takes Isaac his son, gets the firewood ready, and they're on their way to Moriah. It was a 3-day journey. And I don't know about y'all, but I have spent, 15 minutes on a horse before. That was enough. I've walked for, 15 minutes before. That was sure enough. But Abraham, his 2 young men, and Isaac journey for 3 days to the place that God would tell him. And what I get from that is Abraham had a lot of time. He had a lot of time to think, a lot of time to contemplate, a lot of time to feel whatever emotions he was feeling. I like to sort of try to get into Abraham's head here and just ask, how would Abraham have been feeling? I'm sure he would have been hurt. I'm sure he would have had plenty of sadness, probably a lot of confusion, maybe some anger, possibly. Maybe he was feeling a little betrayed by God. The God that he had been serving, pretty much his entire life was now telling him, hey, sacrifice your son to me. All of these things that Abraham must have been feeling, I can certainly relate. But right now, I want to focus on verse 5. Verse 5, and this is, where we usually focus on, because it's so profound, so amazing. But in verse 5, Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there. We will worship and return to you." Some of your versions, I believe the New King James Version puts it as "we will return." Undoubtedly, no matter what Abraham must have been feeling, he was in pain. He was probably in agony. But Abraham trusted in God. That word trust there can be replaced by faith, just like that. They're the same thing, basically. Abraham trusted in God. He trusted that if he went through with this, that everything was going to be okay, no matter how terrible it may have been. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves this morning is, do we have that kind of faith? That even in the midst of the most terrible and most painful thing that Abraham possibly could have ever done, Abraham knew that it would be okay. Now, I know in this building right now that there are people in here, myself included, Lakin included, that have gone through terrible things in this life. I know that there are people in here that have experienced pain and sadness and turmoil and anger. I'm right there with you. And yet, when I experience this, the only thing that gets me through it is my faith in God. The only thing that gets me through the hurt and the pain is trusting that no matter what is happening right now, no matter what is going on in our lives today or tomorrow or 50 years from now, in the end, everything is going to be okay. Because in the end, we'll be with God. We'll be there in perfection with Him forever. And right here, Abraham is absolutely in pain, and yet he knows that everything is going to be okay. Do we have that kind of faith? Now, this is just one of the many reasons why I love assembling with the saints. No matter if it's here or in Gulf Shores or Linden, Tennessee or Lawrenceburg or Turkey. Because when we assemble with the saints, we're around like-minded Christians who have also dedicated themselves to God, who also serve God with all of their hearts, with all their souls, with all their minds. We're in a place where we can recharge, rejuvenate, rededicate our lives to God. I get inspired from coming here, worshiping God, fellowshipping with y'all. And that inspiration motivates me to continue fighting the fight. What better thing do we have to do than be here on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night? There's nothing better. You know, there's nothing better than assembling with the saints. And it breaks my heart when I don't see people on Sunday evenings and Wednesday nights. It breaks my heart when there's a full building here right now, but later on it won't be. And I know that there are things that happen. I know that there are extenuating circumstances, but why wouldn't we want to be here? In a place that we can come together with the best people in the world, because every one of us in here should have Jesus. We all should have Him as our standard, as our light. Why wouldn't we want to come here to grow in our faith? Because it is our faith that saves us. Because it's not a game. You know? It's real. It's 4 hours a week where we completely dedicate that time to God without any distractions, without anything else going on. It's a place where we can grow in that faith to trust in God. We keep on reading in Thank you, Wesley. We keep on reading in verses 6 through 14, and I know this is quite a bit longer than our previous readings, but we're just going to go through this really quickly and talk about it some more. But in Genesis 22, starting in verse 16, going to verse 14, we read, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife, and so the two of them walked on together. And Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. And Abraham said, Here am I, my son. He said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them walked together. And they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there. and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Verse 12, he said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it will be provided. First of all, Genesis 22, 6 through 14, they finally get there. Poor Isaac. I talked about how I couldn't imagine how Abraham must have felt. Can't imagine how Isaac must have felt, the poor boy. They travel for 3 days. They get to this place. I'm sure Isaac has been wondering this whole time, where is this lamb that we're going to slay right here for this offering? And he gets there, and Abraham just throws him on the altar. He probably didn't throw him on it. But I can't imagine how that must have felt. And yet, the moral of the story is not about Isaac, unfortunately. It is absolutely about Abraham and God. Because God saved Isaac from Abraham. Because in the end, and this is, where we usually leave it at, God did not want Isaac. He did not want Abraham to sacrifice Isaac to him. God has never wanted that. He has never demanded human sacrifice, as so many in the land of Canaan did. He's never wanted that. God wanted Abraham. In verse 12, the angel of the Lord comes down, tells Abraham not to hurt the lad. Do not stretch out your hand, because by doing this, by not withholding your son, by not keeping him, by not questioning, by not doubting, by not fleeing from what you were called to do, I have seen, the angel of the Lord says, that you fear and trust in God. God never wanted Isaac. He wanted Abraham. He wanted Abraham to prove he wanted to test Abraham in his faith. Now I want you to remember that, because it'll be important later on. But I want to keep going just a little bit more. We're almost done, I promise, in Genesis 22. But Genesis 22, 15 through 18 says, And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven, and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of your enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Abraham and his descendants, God says here, he swears by himself, because God cannot swear on anything higher but himself. God says that Abraham and his descendants would be blessed because of Abraham's trust. He says that the Messiah would come through Abraham's line because of the faith that he showed right here on this day. And I just wonder, have we ever stopped and wondered how this would have played out if Abraham had failed? If Abraham had withheld Isaac, at any stretch of this journey, I just wonder how this would have come through differently, because Jesus was going to come no matter what. But it would have been through a different person. Would have been through a different family. But because of one person's faith, because of Abraham's faith, salvation came into the world. This whole journey that Abraham went on, the end result of his faith, the end result of Abraham's trust in God, was that the Messiah would be born from the tribe of Judah. And Jesus would die so that we can live. Salvation came because Abraham trusted in God. This morning, do you have that kind of faith? This morning, have you been divinely persuaded, based upon the evidence that the Holy Scriptures give you, to believe in God and to act upon your belief? If the answer is yes, man, that's great. That's awesome. If the answer is no, what needs to happen? What kind of change in your life needs to happen in order for you to be pleasing to God? Do you need prayers? Have you already been baptized? Have you already been added to His church? Have you already partaken in Christ's death, burial, and resurrection in the waters of baptism? If you have, and if you've sinned, if you're a Christian, I encourage you to come forward. This morning, if you are not a Christian, if you've never been baptized, if you have never come into contact with the blood, Romans chapter 6 tells us that baptism is a reenactment of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. We go into the water, our old self, and we come out a new creature. And Christ adds us to His church. There's no other way to be saved. Christ says that He is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one goes to the Father except through Him. This morning, if you have any need whatsoever, I encourage you to come now as we stand and as we sing.